Hello and welcome to Making Cyno's Helm! Little disclaimer first, I don't actually know what I'm doing half the time, so there's a lot of that'll work, but look, it did, it worked, look how pretty it is! But I will walk you through how I did, what I did, and why, and hopefully that'll give you a little insight into my methods and help you out with your own crafting.
Alright, let's get right into it, starting out with drafting out the pattern for the helm. Make sure you do this on top of a wig to add the extra room needed for all that hair. If you haven't used this technique before, quick explanation is to wrap your surface in plastic wrap to protect it, then cover it in duct tape to give yourself a solid base to work off of. Cyno's helm has the little protruding piece in the front, so I built up that area with some tissue paper and then sketched out the shape. Because I added the extra material in front, I then went back and rewrapped the head to ensure the pattern I was using was one continuous flat sheet of tape. I then cut the pattern into 3 pieces in a way that ensured that each piece was as flat as I could make it, as this really helps when shaping the foam later on. When transferring your pattern to foam, make sure you also include the reference marks so you can line up the pieces accurately. I used a 5mm EVA foam for the helm base and carefully lined up the pieces and glued them together using contact cement. Good tip for curved surfaces like this is to warm up the foam a bit before to make it less rigid when gluing them together, and also using the wig head to help form the shape. You could certainly stop there, but I wanted a nice solid helm, so I covered the base in a layer of Warbla, slowly warming the sheet and spreading it over the helm in a smooth layer. You can see on the underside I also added some thick foam in the front to help curve out the edge. Alright, so the base is done, and next up is to add the flaps in the back. You might be wondering why I didn't incorporate them into the base pattern, but I wanted the base to firmly fit on my head so it wouldn't flop around. I started with just the bottom flap using a 2mm EVA foam and smoothing it out with filler and sander primer. The top flap was a little more difficult because I needed it to blend perfectly into the base. So, unfortunately I didn't catch this part on camera, but I used Warbla and kind of melted it on. I then hid the seam by adding 3 to 4 layers of gesso paint and sanding it until smooth. Then it was like 3 days of just sanding, building up the layer with gesso and primer, then sanding it down. Not gonna lie, this sucked. I was also super sick during that time, but I powered through it anyways because I just wanted it done. I even got so fed up with the sanding that I had a moment of rage quit where I bought a pattern on Etsy, spent 4 hours trying to print out the pattern only to get halfway through the helm base and realize I liked my pattern better because this one had no support to prevent the helm from flopping around and just had a very strange layout. Oh, you can see the little Warbla flap here. But yeah, back to it I guess. Once the pieces were finally sanded down to an acceptable level of smoothness, I drafted out all the little details on painter tape so they could easily be transferred to 2mm EVA foam. The ears and side pieces were both made from 5mm foam and attached using hot glue. You can see here that the ears specifically needed a lot of help from the heat gun to shape them into place. Once the small pieces were added, the hard part was over. Look how smooth that is. I am so flipping happy with how this turned out. The last bit for the helm section is to paint. I airbrushed the base in a dark gray, the ears in a purple gradient, and the gold sections in Modern Masters metallic gold. For the complex pattern on the back and the top, I used a Cricut cutter, and this is actually where the bot pattern did come in handy, as I just traced out the pattern from the files, making only a few adjustments for spacing. For the material, I used a black sticker paper, although it still was quite the hassle to actually get the pattern to lie flat. Overall, this was so much easier than having to hand paint it on, except for the little gray sections, those were easy to do myself. Finally moving on to the fabric pieces hanging from the helm. Again, I ended up being very grateful for the pattern I bought since I didn't have to do any of the patterning myself. For the white and black fabric, I went with a cotton as it is stiff enough to hold its shape while still allowing for fabric flow. All the fabric designs were done by cutting out the sections from the printed pattern, then painting with either the airbrush or Lumiere fabric paint. The gold sections were done with an iron-on vinyl, which is usually used with a Cricut cutter, but I decided it would be easier to just trace out the already printed pattern sections. Each of these sections needed to be double-sided for a total of 14 pieces painted. Once my work was approved by the cosplay supervisor, they were then sewn together and flipped inside out to hide the seam. Zaylin was pretty impressed with my work at this point, so he said, "Grab the hot glue, we're ready to assemble."